Hey guys, tonight we begin with a question that sounds almost too simple until you actually sit with it for a second. What did pirates drink when they were 3 weeks from the nearest coastline, surrounded by nothing but salt water in every direction, with a hold full of stolen cargo and a crew that needed something in their cups every single day just to survive the voyage? The answer is stranger, more chemical, and honestly more terrifying than anything Hollywood ever put in a tankard. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture the hold of a ship in the early 1700s. Somewhere below the waterline, stacked in rows, sit dozens of wooden casks, and inside those casks is the one substance every single person aboard needs to survive more than food, more than sleep, more than treasure. Water. And here's the thing nobody tells you when they picture the Golden Age of Piracy. That water, the very thing keeping everyone alive, was often the most dangerous substance on the entire ship. You're a sailor. You've just come off a 4-hour watch in the blazing Caribbean sun, your shirt is soaked through, your tongue feels like a piece of old rope, and all you want in the entire world is a long, cool drink of water. You climb below deck, find the water cask assigned to your mess, and pull the bung. Congratulations, you're about to drink something that has been sitting in a wooden barrel for 6 weeks in tropical heat. The bad news is that 6 weeks is more than enough time for water to stop being water and start being something else entirely. Let's talk about what actually happens inside a water cask on a long voyage, because this is where the whole story begins. The casks were made of oak, sealed with pitch, and they were never ever completely clean before they were filled. Traces of whatever had been in that barrel before, wine, beer, fish brine, lingered in the wood grain no matter how hard the cooper scrubbed it. Add fresh water on top of that residue, seal it in the dark, damp, warm hold of a ship rocking through the tropics. And you've built, whether you meant to or not, the perfect incubator. Algae bloomed in threads along the inside of the barrel. A greenish film formed on the surface. The water didn't just taste bad, it developed its own personality, and that personality was somewhere between pond scum and regret. And it got worse. Because water wasn't just growing algae, it was breeding things with legs. Or at least things that moved, which in the dark of a barrel is functionally the same as having legs. Tiny organisms bred in standing water the way weevils bred in ship's biscuit. And sailors who'd been at sea long enough developed a very particular skill, drinking through their teeth. You'd clench your jaw, strain the water through the gaps, and try very hard not to think too closely about what you'd just filtered out. Some accounts describe sailors drinking in the dark specifically, so they didn't have to see what was floating in the cup. Ignorance, in this one specific case, was considered a mercy. Here's the part that really should keep you up at night. Except this is a sleep channel, so let's gently ease past it. Nobody in the 1600s or 1700s understood germ theory. There was no concept of bacteria, no idea that invisible organisms in water could cause dysentery, cholera, or the violent stomach illnesses that swept through ships with grim regularity. Sailors didn't know why bad water made you sick. They just knew that it did. Sometimes. And that sometimes it didn't. And the whole thing felt like a lottery you were forced to play every single day of your life at sea. Some blamed bad air. Some blamed the moon. Some just accepted that a portion of any long voyage's crew would die of something in the belly, and there was nothing anyone could do about it except pray and hope your particular barrel hadn't gone all the way bad yet. You might be thinking, why not just get more water more often? Surely a ship could stop and refill. And sure, in theory, that's exactly what happened. Ships would put in at islands, rivers, and coastal streams to refill their casks whenever possible. But here's the catch, and it's a big one. A pirate ship, by definition, could not simply sail into a friendly, well-stocked port and ask the harbour master for fresh water. Thank you very much. Pirates operated outside the law, which meant every port was a calculated risk, every landing was a potential trap, and reliable freshwater sources on remote coastlines were not exactly plentiful. Sometimes a landing party would find a stream. Sometimes they'd find nothing but brackish swamp water that was arguably worse than what was already rotting in the hold. And sometimes, especially in the driest stretches of the Caribbean, there simply wasn't a good source for 100 miles in any direction. Rainwater seemed like the obvious backup plan, and crews absolutely did collect it whenever a storm rolled through, rigging sailcloth into makeshift funnels and catching every drop they could into open barrels. But those open barrels sat on deck, exposed to salt spray, bird droppings, and whatever else happened to land in them during a storm at sea. It was marginally better than the water already going bad below deck. Marginally, which in this story is doing an enormous amount of work. Sailors weren't entirely passive about this, either. Faced with a barrel of increasingly suspicious water, crews across the age of sail developed their own rough folk remedies, none of them backed by anything resembling real science, but all of them attempts to wrestle back some control over a substance that had clearly turned against them. Straining water through cloth was common, removing the larger, more visible offenders even if it did nothing whatsoever about what was actually making people sick. Some crews swore by adding a splash of vinegar to a cup of questionable water, on the theory that its sharpness somehow cut through the corruption. Others added wine or a measure of spirits directly to the water itself, which, unbeknownst to them, was actually one of the very few folk remedies on this list that did something genuinely useful, since alcohol at even a modest concentration really could suppress some of the bacterial growth responsible for the worst of it. Charcoal, when available, was sometimes packed into the neck of a cask on the theory that it would filter out impurities as water passed through. A technique that again had more accidental merit than the sailors who practiced it could have possibly known. None of it was reliable, and none of it was consistent from ship to ship or captain to captain. What is consistent, across ship's logs, court records and the surviving journals of physicians who sailed with naval expeditions, is the sheer regularity with which crews were laid low by what they simply called the flux, a catch-all term for the violent stomach and intestinal illness that swept through a ship's company with grim predictability on any voyage that stretched much beyond a few weeks. A captain's log noting half the crew unfit for duty due to the flux wasn't an unusual entry. It was closer to routine bookkeeping. Entire naval expeditions in this era lost more men to disease, much of it originating from contaminated water and spoiled provisions, than they ever lost to combat. A statistic that tends to surprise people who picture the Age of Sail as primarily a story of cannon fire and boarding actions. The real killer, more often than not, was sitting quietly in a cask below deck the entire time. So here's where the pirate mind, and honestly the sailing mind more broadly across the Age of Sail, arrived at a solution that sounds almost backwards to modern ears. If water couldn't be trusted, then something needed to be added to it, or something needed to replace it altogether that would actually make it safer to drink rather than more dangerous. And as it turned out, the answer had been sitting in barrels of its own the entire time. Alcohol, not for the buzz, not for the fun of it, though certainly nobody was complaining about that part. Alcohol, in its various fermented and distilled forms, killed off many of the exact organisms that were making the water dangerous in the first place. Brewing and distilling both involve boiling, which sterilizes the liquid, and the resulting alcohol content made it much harder for bacteria to multiply afterward. Pirates and merchant sailors alike didn't understand the chemistry, but they understood the pattern. The crews who drank beer, wine, or spirits instead of straight water got sick less often. And once you notice a pattern like that on a ship where getting sick could mean getting left behind, you don't need a microscope to convince you to change your habits. So what actually filled the cups on a pirate ship, hour after hour, day after day, for months at a time? That's exactly where we're headed next, starting with the drink that came before rum ever took over the story. The humble, watery, surprisingly essential daily ration known as small beer. Long before rum became the drink synonymous with piracy, there was small beer, and if you want to understand the drinking culture of any ship in the age of sail, pirate or otherwise, you have to start here, because this was the actual daily bread and water of a sailor's existence, quite literally standing in for both. Small beer, sometimes called table beer or ship's beer, was a low-alcohol brew, usually somewhere around 1 to 3% alcohol by volume, which is a fraction of what you'd find in a modern beer. It wasn't meant to get anyone drunk. It was meant to be safe, filling, and drinkable in enormous quantities without leaving a grown man face down on the deck by lunchtime. Children drank it. The elderly drank it. It was, in the most literal sense possible, the water substitute for entire nations, not just for sailors, because in an era before reliable sanitation, brewing was one of the only widely available processes that reliably killed off the nastiest things lurking in a water supply. Here's how it worked, and it's honestly a rather elegant piece of accidental food science for a time period that didn't understand food science at all. Brewing beer requires boiling the water as part of the process, usually while it's mixed with malted grain, to extract the sugars needed for fermentation. That boiling step sterilizes the water outright. Then, once the wort cools and yeast is added, fermentation produces alcohol, which continues to suppress the growth of harmful bacteria even after the brewing is finished. The end result is a beverage that started as potentially dangerous water and came out the other side as something that could sit in a cask for weeks without turning into the swamp-flavoured horror show we just described in the last chapter. Ships heading out on long voyages loaded enormous quantities of small beer before departure, sometimes allotting each sailor a gallon or more per day as part of his official ration. A gallon of beer per person, per day. If that sounds like an alarming amount of liquid to consume, remember that this wasn't strong beer. It was barely stronger than what you'd get from letting bread dough sit a little too long. And it was doing double duty as both hydration and, frankly, a decent source of calories from the leftover grain sugars. Sailors doing 12 hours of back-breaking physical labour needed the calories almost as much as they needed the hydration, and small beer quietly provided both. Now here's the problem, and it's the same problem that haunts basically every solution in this story. Beer doesn't keep forever either. It's better than raw water, dramatically better, but it still degrades over time, especially in the heat of a tropical hold. Especially when a ship's voyage stretched on longer than expected because of bad winds, chasing prey, or being chased in turn. A cask of small beer that was perfectly fine in week 2 might be flat, sour, and unpleasant by week 8. Not dangerous in the same way spoiled water was dangerous, but increasingly unappetizing, and on a long enough voyage, the beer supply simply ran out entirely before the voyage did. And when the beer ran dry and the water had already gone foul, a crew needed a backup plan, preferably one with a higher alcohol content, because higher alcohol content meant longer shelf life, smaller storage volume for the same preservative effect, and, let's be honest, sailors who had just watched their beer supply vanish were not exactly opposed to trading up. This is also where we need to talk about a detail that surprises a lot of people: the sheer logistics of turning beer into a workable, shipboard institution. Some larger vessels actually carried the equipment to brew fresh beer on board during a voyage, though this was more common on longer naval expeditions than on the smaller, faster ships favoured by pirate crews, who valued speed and manoeuvrability over carrying heavy brewing equipment they didn't strictly need. Most pirate vessels instead loaded up on beer, wine, and eventually spirits from whatever port they last visited, or, and this happened constantly, simply took what they needed from captured merchant vessels. A prize ship loaded with casks of beer or wine bound for a colonial market was, from a pirate's perspective, not just a payday. It was a floating tavern that had wandered directly into their path, and crews would often prioritize liquid cargo almost as highly as coin, because coin doesn't do anything for you on a hot afternoon 3 weeks from land, but a fresh cask absolutely does. There's also a wonderfully practical detail buried in here about who actually drank what, because beer wasn't handed out with total equality. Officers and captains on merchant and naval vessels often had access to better quality beer, wine, or spirits, kept separately from the common stock, while the ordinary crew drank whatever the general ration provided. On a pirate ship, though, and this is one of the genuinely fascinating quirks of pirate culture that we've touched on in other videos, the democratic structure of most pirate crews meant that captured liquor was often divided far more evenly than it would have been on a naval or merchant vessel. The pirate code, the actual written or spoken articles that governed conduct aboard many pirate ships, sometimes explicitly addressed how captured drink would be shared, because alcohol wasn't just refreshment, it was currency. It was morale, and mismanaging its distribution could tip a crew from contentment straight into mutiny. It's worth pausing here on one of the most underappreciated figures in this entire story, the ship's cooper, the craftsman responsible for building and maintaining every single cask aboard the vessel, the beer casks, the water casks, the eventual rum casks, all of it. A poorly made or poorly sealed cask could ruin an entire supply of drink within days, turning a carefully loaded voyage's worth of provisions into a stinking, undrinkable liability before the ship had even cleared sight of land. A skilled cooper was worth his weight in trust aboard any vessel, pirate or otherwise, and the state of a ship's barrels said almost as much about its readiness for a long voyage as the state of its sails or its cannon. Pirate crews capturing a merchant vessel would sometimes specifically look to recruit a skilled cooper among the captured crew, offering him a share and a place aboard rather than simply releasing him with the rest, because good barrel making was a scarce and genuinely essential skill in a world where everything you drank for months at a time depended entirely on the wood it was stored in. There were national and regional flavours to all of this too, in ways that shaped exactly what ended up in a given cruise cups, depending on where the ship or its captured cargo had originated. English ships tended to favour their own style of beer brewed from barley malt, while Dutch vessels, drawing on the Netherlands' own long brewing tradition, carried their own regional variations, and both differed again from the wine-heavy provisioning favoured by French and Iberian ships sailing out of wine, producing regions where beer was simply less central to the culture in the first place. A pirate crew, being by nature a floating, multinational, often quite literally multi-ethnic community drawn from captured sailors, escaped indentured servants, and volunteers from a dozen different ports, ended up with a drinking culture that was similarly blended, an unofficial, ever-shifting fusion of English beer habits, Dutch brewing traditions, French wine preferences, and whatever local drink happened to be available in the specific stretch of ocean the crew was currently haunting. And that transition from a beer-based daily ration into something stronger, harder, and far more dangerous in every sense of the word brings us to the drink that pirates are actually remembered for. Rum. Because as small beer's usefulness declined the longer a voyage stretched, and as pirates increasingly found themselves operating in the Caribbean, right on top of the single greatest concentration of sugar production on the planet, a new drink was waiting. One that would come to define an entire era, an entire aesthetic, and an entire mythology that still exists in the popular imagination centuries later. Now let's talk about rum, because if there's one drink that has become permanently welded to the idea of piracy in the popular imagination, it's this one, and the actual history behind it is stranger and more industrial than the romantic image most people carry around in their heads. Rum wasn't invented by pirates, and it wasn't invented for pirates. It was, in the most unglamorous sense possible, a byproduct. Specifically, it was a byproduct of the sugar industry, and to understand rum, you first have to understand what sugar production actually looked like in the Caribbean during the 17th century, because it's an ugly picture, and it's inseparable from the drink that came out of it. Sugar cane, once harvested, was crushed to extract its juice, and that juice was boiled down repeatedly to crystallize sugar for export back to Europe, where it fetched enormous prices. But the boiling and crystallization process left behind a thick, dark, sticky residue called molasses, and early on, plantation owners genuinely didn't know what to do with all of it. It was too abundant to simply throw away, and someone, likely enslaved workers on the plantations themselves, who bore the brunt of the entire brutal sugar economy, discovered that molasses could be fermented and then distilled into a potent spirit. The earliest versions of this spirit were rough, harsh, and reportedly tasted like something between industrial solvent and regret, which is why the earliest recorded name for it wasn't rum at all. It was called Kill Devil, a name that tells you almost everything you need to know about the drinking experience in those first few decades. Barbados gets much of the credit as the birthplace of rum as an actual refined industry, with distilleries developing there through the middle of the 17th century that improved the process considerably from those early Kill Devil days. From Barbados, the drink and the knowledge of how to make it spread rapidly across the Caribbean, into Jamaica, into the smaller islands. Wherever sugar was being grown and molasses was piling up as a byproduct, nobody had a better use for. And here's the detail that connects it directly back to our earlier chapters. Rum, because it was distilled rather than merely fermented, had a dramatically higher alcohol content than either beer or wine, which meant two enormously practical advantages for anyone spending months at sea. First, it kept far longer than beer without spoiling, which solved the exact shelf life problem that plagued small beer on long voyages. Second, it took up far less storage space to deliver the same preservative and intoxicating effect, which meant a ship could carry a smaller volume of rum to achieve the same purpose that would have required a much larger volume of beer. For a pirate operating specifically in Caribbean waters, this was close to perfect. You didn't need to import anything from Europe. The raw material and the finished product were both being produced constantly, in massive quantities, right in the exact waters where pirates were already operating, on plantations run by the very merchant class that pirates preyed upon. Capturing a ship loaded with rum, or raiding a coastal warehouse, wasn't some rare stroke of luck. It was practically a routine Tuesday. Rum flowed through pirate crews, not because pirates had some special cultural attachment to it from the outset, but because it was everywhere. It was strong, it travelled well, and it did the same water-purifying job that beer had always done, just more efficiently and in a smaller barrel. There's a detail about rum quality control that tends to surprise people, because it reveals just how seriously sailors took the question of exactly how strong their rum actually was. Rum could vary enormously in strength depending on how it was distilled and by whom, and a sailor being handed his ration needed some reliable way of confirming he wasn't being cheated with watered-down liquor. The solution that emerged, and this is genuinely one of history's more delightful bits of applied chemistry performed by drunk people with something to prove, was the gunpowder proof test. A small amount of gunpowder would be soaked in the rum in question, and then someone would attempt to light it. If the gunpowder, despite being soaked in liquid, still ignited, that meant the rum was strong enough, roughly 57% alcohol by volume in modern terms, to be declared proof, a word we still use today when describing the strength of spirits. Even though almost nobody using the term realizes it originated with sailors literally setting fire to their liquor ration to make sure nobody was ripping them off. Drinking rum straight, at that strength, was genuinely rough on the body, and even hardened pirate crews often diluted it rather than drinking it neat all the time. This is where a drink called bumbu, sometimes spelled bumbo, comes into the story. A concoction of rum mixed with water, sugar, and often a grating of nutmeg, which softened the harshness of straight rum while stretching a limited supply across more servings. Bumbu shows up repeatedly in accounts of pirate life as a favoured shipboard drink, warm, sweet, spiced, and just strong enough to take the edge off an otherwise miserable day at sea without leaving the entire crew too incapacitated to sail the ship if trouble showed up on the horizon. Rum's rise also can't be separated from the darker economic machine that produced it in the first place, and it's worth being honest about that, rather than glossing over it for the sake of a tidy story. The sugar plantations of the Caribbean ran on the forced labour of enslaved Africans, transported across the Atlantic under conditions of almost unimaginable cruelty. And the molasses that eventually became rum was quite literally a byproduct of that same system. Rum, sugar, and the broader triangular trade connecting Europe, West Africa, and the Americas were bound together so tightly that no honest account of one can leave out the others. Pirates, for their part, existed in a strange and uncomfortable relationship to this system, sometimes preying directly on the slave ships themselves, and occasionally freeing or recruiting captives aboard, sometimes participating in the trade in other ways entirely, and the reality resists any simple, comfortable narrative in either direction. What is unambiguous is that certain port towns grew explosively wealthy and explosively lawless, specifically because of rum's central place in Caribbean commerce, and no town illustrates this better than Port Royal, Jamaica, which by the late 17th century had earned a reputation, only half exaggerated, as one of the wickedest and most drink-soaked settlements on the planet. Contemporary accounts describe a town absolutely saturated with taverns, sometimes estimated at one drinking establishment for every small handful of residents, a concentration of rum shops that would be extraordinary by any standard in any era. Port Royal thrived precisely because it sat at the intersection of sugar production, colonial shipping, and a large transient population of sailors, merchants, and yes, pirates, all of whom had coin to spend and very few other entertainments competing for it. We'll come back to Port Royal specifically a little later tonight, because its story deserves its own proper telling, but for now it's enough to understand that rum wasn't just a drink pirates happened to consume. It was the literal economic bloodstream running through the entire Caribbean world pirates operated within, from the sugar fields to the taverns to the casks, stowed in the hold of every ship worth capturing. And trouble showing up on the horizon is exactly the tension that rum introduced into pirate life that beer never quite did in the same way. Beer, at its low alcohol content, could be consumed constantly throughout the day without seriously impairing a crew. Rum could not. A crew that had gotten too deep into a captured cask of rum was a crew that might not respond quickly or competently if a naval frigate appeared on the horizon, or if a storm rolled in without warning, or if a fight broke out over exactly whose turn it was to finish the bottle. This tension between rum as a practical, water-replacing necessity and rum as a genuine operational hazard is something we'll come back to later in this video, because it caused real, documented disasters. But first, it's worth understanding how naval authorities, watching their own sailors struggle with exactly this same problem, eventually arrived at a very deliberate, very institutional solution of their own. A drink that would go on to become just as iconic as rum itself, but for entirely different, far more controlled reasons. Grog, if rum was the chaotic, plentiful, morale-boosting chaos agent of the pirate world, grog was the exact opposite. Grog was rum's more responsible, government-regulated cousin, and its origin story is one of the more oddly specific moments in naval history, where you can point to an actual person, an actual date, and an actual reason a drinking tradition came into existence. By the early 1700s, navies across Europe, particularly the British Royal Navy, had adopted the practice of issuing sailors a daily rum ration, following much the same logic pirates had already stumbled onto. Rum kept well, travelled compactly, and served as a reliable water substitute on long voyages. The standard ration in the British Navy was, by modern standards, staggering. Roughly half a pint of rum per sailor per day, delivered straight, undiluted, no questions asked. And if you're doing the mental math right now and wondering how an entire fleet of sailors managed to operate heavy machinery, climb rigging in storms, and fire cannons accurately while drinking that much rum daily, congratulations. You've identified precisely the problem that led to the invention of grog. Admiral Edward Vernon, commanding British naval forces in the West Indies in the year 1740, grew increasingly concerned about the state of discipline and competence among crews who were, by his own observation, functionally intoxicated for a meaningful portion of every single day. His solution, implemented as an order across his command, was to dilute the rum ration with water before it was issued, cutting the effective alcohol content roughly in half and, in the process, stretching the water supply itself a little further, since a diluted rum ration also meant less foul-tasting water needed to be consumed on its own. Vernon was known among his sailors for wearing a coat made of a coarse fabric called grogram, and sailors, who have never in the history of the sea missed an opportunity for a nickname, began calling him Old Grog. When his diluted rum ration caught on, and eventually became standard practice across the entire Royal Navy, the drink itself inherited his nickname. Grog, now here's where it gets genuinely clever, in a way that connects directly back to our earlier discussion of exactly why sailors needed something other than plain water in the first place. Diluting rum with water didn't just reduce drunkenness on deck, though that was certainly the primary and immediate goal. It also meant that the water itself, the increasingly foul, algae-laced, occasionally worm-infested water sitting in the ship's hold, was being consumed in a form that made it far more palatable, and thanks to the alcohol content still present in the mixture, considerably safer than drinking it straight. Grog effectively solved two problems that had been plaguing sailors since the beginning of long ocean voyages: drunkenness on the one hand and unsafe drinking water on the other, with a single, elegantly simple modification to an existing ration. The recipe evolved further over the following decades, and this is where grog picks up an additional, genuinely life-saving ingredient that had nothing to do with alcohol content at all. Sailors on long voyages suffered terribly from scurvy, a disease caused by vitamin C deficiency that could kill entire crews on extended voyages without fresh produce, and it took the better part of the 18th century for naval authorities to conclusively connect scurvy to diet and, eventually, to citrus specifically. Once that connection was firmly established, largely credited to the work of naval surgeon James Lind, and later formalised through the efforts of physicians and naval administrators who followed him, citrus juice, most commonly lime juice, began to be added to the grog ration as a standard practice. This addition is actually where the term limey, still used today as a nickname for British sailors, and by extension British people generally, originated, a linguistic fossil left behind by a drinking ritual that was simultaneously fighting drunkenness, unsafe water, and a deadly nutritional disease all at the same time with one single daily cup. The actual ceremony of serving grog aboard a naval vessel developed its own rituals and its own vocabulary over time. Sailors would gather at a designated hour, often around noon, around what was called the grog tub, sometimes decorated or lettered with mottos, where the day's ration was mixed and distributed under supervision to prevent hoarding, theft, or the kind of dangerous overconsumption that had prompted the whole reform in the first place. Being denied your grog ration as a disciplinary punishment was considered a genuinely serious consequence, a fact that tells you everything about how central this daily ritual had become to shipboard morale and shipboard life more broadly. And this is also where we get another word still floating around in modern English, groggy, describing exactly the sluggish, disoriented feeling of a sailor who'd had his daily grog and was easing back into afternoon duties with slightly softened edges. It's worth slowing down on exactly how the scurvy connection was established, because it's one of the genuinely interesting early moments of something resembling a controlled scientific experiment showing up in naval medicine. In 1747, the naval surgeon James Lind, aboard the ship Salisbury, took 12 sailors already suffering from scurvy and divided them into pairs, giving each pair a different proposed remedy alongside their normal rations. One pair received cider, one received vinegar, one received seawater, one received a paste of garlic and mustard, one received a mild acid, and one, crucially, received 2 oranges and a lemon daily. The pair receiving citrus recovered dramatically faster than every other group, a result that, in hindsight, looks almost embarrassingly obvious, but which took decades longer to actually filter through into official naval policy than you might expect, partly because nobody yet understood why citrus worked, only that it did. It would take until the later part of the 18th century for citrus to become a truly standardized addition to the naval ration, folded into the existing grog tradition rather than replacing it, giving sailors a daily cup that was simultaneously fighting drunkenness, unsafe water, and a disease that had quietly killed more sailors across the age of sail than combat. Storms and shipwreck combined. The grog ration, remarkably, outlived the age of sail itself by an enormous margin, persisting as an official daily allowance in the Royal Navy all the way into the 20th century. A genuinely astonishing piece of institutional continuity for a tradition that began as one admiral's fairly simple fix for drunken sailors in 1740. It wasn't formally abolished until the 31st of July 1970, a date sailors at the time nicknamed Black Tot Day, marking the final official rum ration ever issued aboard a Royal Navy vessel, more than 230 years after Admiral Vernon first ordered his cruises rum cut with water in the tropical heat of the West Indies. Now, it's worth being honest here about where grog actually fits into pirate history specifically, because grog is fundamentally a naval institution developed by and for organised government-funded fleets with the administrative structure to formalise a daily ration schedule and enforce discipline around it. Pirate crews, operating outside any formal chain of command, with far less standardised supply chains and far more variable access to fresh water for dilution in the first place, were somewhat less consistent in adopting grog as a formal daily practice compared to naval crews. That said, the underlying logic, diluting strong spirits with water both to stretch the supply and to reduce dangerous drunkenness, absolutely appeared informally on pirate ships as well, particularly through drinks like the bamboo we discussed earlier, which followed essentially the same principle of cutting rum with water and other ingredients rather than drinking it entirely straight. The pirate version was simply less standardized, less centrally enforced, and considerably more chaotic in its actual execution, which, if you've been paying attention to this video so far, should not surprise you even slightly. So we've covered water, beer, rum, and grog, the 4 pillars, more or less, of what kept sailors and pirates hydrated, intoxicated, and occasionally alive across the age of sail. But knowing the categories of drink is only half the story. What did an actual day of drinking look like aboard a working pirate vessel specifically? What was in your cup depending on where you were, what you'd just captured, and what time of day it happened to be? That's exactly where we're headed next. You're a member of a pirate crew somewhere in the Caribbean, sometime in the early 1700s, and it's time to talk about what your actual day-to-day drinking life looks like, because it was a far more varied, far more improvised, and honestly far more interesting experience than simply cracking open the same barrel of rum morning, noon and night. Your morning begins, as it does for most working sailors of this era, with something to eat and something to drink before the heavier labour of the day begins. If the ship still has small beer in stock, that's likely what fills your cup, watery, faintly sour. But familiar and safe in a way that raw water hasn't been for weeks. If the beer supply has run dry, which on a longer voyage it eventually will, you're looking at diluted rum instead, likely mixed into something resembling the bamboo we discussed a moment ago, sweetened just enough with whatever sugar happens to be aboard to make the whole thing bearable before a full day of hauling rope and scrubbing deck. It's worth pausing on exactly what all of this actually tasted like, because it's easy to talk about beer, rum and grog in the abstract, without ever confronting the genuinely unpleasant sensory reality most of it involved. Small beer that had been sitting in a cask for weeks in tropical heat had likely gone flat and noticeably sour well before it reached your cup, closer in character to a mildly alcoholic vinegar than anything resembling a fresh cold beer today. Rough, poorly aged rum straight from a hastily run distillery could be genuinely harsh, burning on the way down in a way that had far more to do with impurities and inconsistent distillation than with any deliberate strength, closer to the original Kill Devil reputation than to a smooth, carefully aged spirit. Bamboo, mixing that same harsh rum with water, sugar and nutmeg, existed largely as a solution to exactly this problem, an attempt to mask genuinely unpleasant raw spirits behind enough sweetness and spice to make the whole thing bearable, and accounts from the era suggest it worked reasonably well for exactly that limited purpose. Even if it would strike a modern palate as a strange, overly sweet way to drink what was, underneath the sugar and spice, still quite rough liquor. Here's something that surprises people about the actual social structure of drinking aboard a pirate ship specifically, as opposed to a naval or merchant vessel. Because many pirate crews operated under a written or verbally agreed set of articles, essentially a code of conduct that every crew member signed onto before a voyage began. Drinking wasn't simply a free-for-all governed by whoever grabbed the nearest bottle first. Some ships' articles explicitly addressed alcohol, sometimes restricting when and how much could be consumed, particularly in the lead-up to combat or during specific watches when sobriety was operationally essential. This wasn't puritanical moralizing, it was pure practicality. A crew member too drunk to climb rigging during a chase, or too impaired to load a cannon accurately during a boarding action, wasn't just a personal liability, he was a threat to the entire crew's survival, and pirate crews, contrary to their lawless reputation, were often remarkably pragmatic about managing exactly this kind of risk through their own internal rules. Now let's talk about where your drink actually comes from on any given day. Because unlike a naval vessel with a predictable supply chain running back to a home port, a pirate ship's liquor cabinet was, to put it gently, an ongoing improvisation. If your crew has recently captured a merchant vessel, and merchant vessels captured in Caribbean and Atlantic waters very frequently carried liquor as cargo bound for colonial markets, your options for the evening have just dramatically expanded. Wine, imported from Europe and bound for wealthy colonial households, was a fairly common find aboard captured ships, and Madeira wine in particular. A fortified wine from the Portuguese island of the same name was popular precisely because its higher alcohol content and the fortification process gave it excellent shelf stability for long ocean voyages, the exact quality pirates valued in absolutely everything they consumed at sea. Brandy showed up regularly too, distilled from wine and carrying an even higher alcohol content than the wine it came from. Prized for many of the same reasons rum was prized: compact, strong, long-lasting, and crucially, already sitting in someone else's cargo hold, waiting to be redistributed by force. And depending on which waters your crew happen to be operating in, you might find yourself drinking things that never appear in the popular pirate imagination at all. Crews raiding along the West African coast or trading, sometimes willingly and sometimes not, with local populations there occasionally encountered palm wine, a fermented drink tapped directly from palm trees, which was an entirely novel experience for a European sailor whose entire frame of reference for alcohol had previously been grain, grape, and sugarcane. Crews operating in the Indian Ocean, particularly during the later years of piracy's Golden Age, when figures based out of places like Madagascar extended piracy's reach well beyond the Caribbean, encountered arak, a spirit distilled from rice, sugarcane, or palm sap depending on the region, which had been produced across South and Southeast Asia for centuries before any European ship ever sailed those waters. It's worth pausing here to note that not every liquid a pirate crew consumed was alcoholic, even if alcohol dominated the ration by a wide margin. Landfall in tropical regions brought access to coconuts, and coconut water, drawn straight from a freshly opened green coconut, was recognised even at the time as a genuinely safe, refreshing drink that hadn't been sitting in a cask growing algae for 6 weeks. A small taste of something clean and simple in a diet otherwise, built almost entirely around preserved, fermented or distilled liquids. Crews making landfall in Central and South America occasionally encountered chocolate, prepared as a drink rather than the solid confection modern audiences would recognise, following recipes with roots in Mesoamerican tradition that had already been adapted somewhat by Spanish colonial households by this point in history, mixed with sugar, spices, and sometimes chili in ways that would have struck an English or French sailor as thoroughly exotic. And later in the Golden Age of Piracy, as the century wore on, tea and coffee both began making occasional appearances aboard ship as well, imported goods that were still very much luxury items rather than daily staples, but which occasionally turned up in a captured cargo hold alongside the wine and rum, offering crews a genuine novelty for however long the supply lasted. None of this displaced alcohol as the backbone of shipboard drinking in any meaningful way. Water remained dangerous, beer and rum remained the practical daily solution, and a green coconut wasn't going to feed an entire crew through a 3-month Atlantic crossing. But it's a useful reminder that pirate life, for all its grim necessity around drink, still had room for genuine variety and even occasional small luxury, whenever a landfall or a lucky capture provided the opportunity. The point here, and it's worth sitting with for a moment, is that a pirate's drinking life wasn't a static single beverage existence built entirely around rum, the way popular culture likes to portray it. It was an ongoing, geographically sprawling improvisation, built from whatever had most recently been captured, traded for, or discovered in whatever port or coastline the ship happened to be near. Your rum this month might have been distilled in Barbados. Your wine last month might have started its journey in Portugal, bound for a wealthy planter's dinner table before your crew redirected its destination rather permanently. The actual lived experience of pirate drinking was less a single tradition and more a rolling inventory of whatever the sea had most recently handed over. Evenings aboard ship carried their own particular drinking culture, less about hydration and practical necessity, and more about morale, community, and the kind of bonding that kept a crew of dangerous, heavily armed men from turning on each other during months of close confinement. Storytelling, singing, and gambling, where the ship's articles permitted it, which not all of them did, filled the hours after the day's labour was done, and drink flowed through all of it as the social lubricant holding a genuinely difficult, dangerous, and psychologically taxing lifestyle together. Music was common too, with many crews carrying at least 1 or 2 musicians aboard specifically to provide entertainment during these evening hours, and it's genuinely difficult to overstate how much a shared cup and a shared song did to hold together a community of men who had, in many cases, deliberately chosen to live entirely outside the protection and structure of ordinary society. Superstition wound its way through nearly all of this drinking, in ways that tell you a great deal about how genuinely dangerous and unpredictable a sailor's life actually was. Toasting before a drink wasn't just a pleasant formality, it carried real weight aboard a ship, where death by drowning, disease, or combat was a constant looming possibility, and toasts to absent friends, to a safe voyage, or to the souls of shipmates already lost, were a common feature of evening drinking sessions. Spilling a drink was, in many maritime traditions, considered a genuinely bad omen, and sailors who prized their superstitions, which was most of them, treated a dropped cup of rum with real unease rather than simple annoyance at the waist. Some crews maintained the practice of pouring out a small portion of their own ration onto the deck before drinking, an offering of sorts to the sea itself or to shipmates who hadn't survived to share the current voyage, a custom that has echoes stretching forward all the way into modern naval and even prison culture, where pouring one out for someone remains a recognisable gesture centuries later. Gambling, where a crew's articles permitted it, often went hand in hand with drinking during the evening hours, dice and card games providing both entertainment and inevitably a fresh source of tension that captains had to keep half an eye on. Some pirate codes banned gambling outright, precisely because a crew of armed. Occasionally drunk men arguing over a rigged dice game was exactly the kind of situation that could turn violent in seconds, and a captain who allowed that risk to fester without any rules governing it was inviting exactly the kind of disorder that could tear a crew apart from the inside long before any naval frigate ever got the chance to do it from the outside. Where gambling was permitted, it usually came with its own informal rules about how disputes would be settled, sometimes deferred to be resolved on land with a formal duel rather than in the heat of the moment aboard ship, a genuinely clever piece of built-in cooling-off time that kept minor disputes from escalating into immediate bloodshed. But here's the thing about all of this drinking, all of this necessary, morale-boosting, water-purifying, community-building consumption of alcohol day after day, week after week, month after month. It didn't always end well. And in our final chapter tonight, we need to talk honestly about the moments when drink stopped being pirate life's quiet daily comfort and started being its downfall, sometimes for a single unlucky sailor, and sometimes for an entire crew. There's one more job aboard ship worth walking through before we move on, because it sat at the exact intersection of everything we've discussed tonight, food and drink together, and it belonged to a man whose skill, or lack of it, could shape the mood of an entire crew far more than his modest standing aboard ship might suggest. You're the ship's cook, and your galley, cramped, hot, and dangerously close to an open flame on a wooden vessel packed with gunpowder, is where food and drink both actually come together before they ever reach a sailor's hands. Your day begins before most of the crew is even properly awake, coaxing the galley fire back to life, a genuinely delicate task on a rocking ship where an unattended flame could mean catastrophe rather than mere inconvenience, which is exactly why cooking fires were treated with such intense caution and were sometimes doused entirely during rough weather or combat, leaving the crew to make do with cold rations until conditions improved. Once your fire is going, you're not just preparing the day's food, salted meat boiled soft enough to be chewable, whatever biscuit hasn't yet succumbed entirely to weevils, perhaps a thin stew if ingredients allow. You're also, on many ships, responsible for preparing at least part of the day's drink ration, heating water for the crew's morning bamboo if rum is on the menu, or managing the ongoing task of checking the beer casks for the first signs of the souring we discussed earlier tonight. Mixing bamboo properly is, in its own small way, a genuine skill, and a cook with a heavy hand on the rum or a stingy one with the sugar and nutmeg could genuinely affect crew morale in ways that seem almost absurd given how small the actual difference amounts to. Too weak, and the crew grumbles that they're being cheated of their proper ration. Too strong, and you risk the exact operational hazards we've spent half this video discussing, a crew too loosened up by an overly generous cook to respond sharply if trouble appears. A skilled ship's cook learned to read his crew, to know when a slightly more generous hand was worth the morale boost after a hard stretch of bad weather or a disappointing raid, and when a stricter measure was called for because the captain had made clear that sharpness, not comfort, was the priority for the day ahead. Rum showed up in your actual cooking too, not just in the cups. Meat could be preserved for slightly longer when packed or basted with high-proof spirits, a trick that wouldn't have been explained in any scientific terms available to you, but which every experienced cook knew worked from direct, repeated experience, watching meat treated this way last a few extra days compared to meat that wasn't. Flambing, setting a dish briefly alight with spirits poured over it, wasn't purely a technique for flavour either, though it did improve the taste of otherwise unremarkable preserved meat considerably. It also served a genuinely practical purpose, burning off some of the harsher, less pleasant qualities of rough, barely aged rum before it was poured over food meant to be eaten, rather than simply drunk. You're also, whether officially or not, one of the crew's informal record keepers of exactly how much drink remains, since your galley sits close to the stores and you're handling casks and bottles constantly throughout your working day. A good relationship between the cook and the quartermaster mattered enormously here. Two men whose jobs overlapped constantly around the exact same scarce resources, and a cook who quietly flagged a cask going bad before it was formally due for inspection, or who noticed stock disappearing faster than the official ration should account for, was doing quiet, essential work protecting the fairness of the entire system the rest of the crew depended on. And there's a particular kind of respect that came with being a good ship's cook, distinct from the respect earned through combat prowess or navigational skill, but genuinely significant nonetheless. A crew fed well and watered fairly, even under difficult conditions, was a considerably happier and more cohesive crew than one constantly nursing grievances about thin stew and short rations. And pirate crews, given their unusually democratic structure compared to naval or merchant vessels, often had real say in exactly who held this position and how well he was doing it. A cook who consistently disappointed his crew, whether through genuine incompetence or through skimming more than his fair share off the top, could find himself voted out of the role, or worse. In exactly the same way an underperforming captain could find himself voted out of command. In a life built around scarcity, uncertainty, and constant physical hardship, the person managing your food and your daily ration of drink held a quiet, underappreciated kind of power, and the good ones understood exactly how much that power mattered to the men depending on them. Before we go any further, there's one figure in this entire story who deserves his own chapter, precisely because he broke every pattern we've discussed so far, and understanding why he broke it tells you almost as much about pirate drinking culture as every other example combined. Bartholomew Roberts, often called Black Bart, was, by nearly every measure available to historians, the most successful pirate of the entire Golden Age, credited with capturing somewhere in the range of 400 vessels over the course of his relatively brief career in the early 1720s, a scale of plunder that dwarfs even the more famous names like Blackbeard. And Bartholomew Roberts, the most successful pirate who ever lived, was, by multiple contemporary accounts, essentially a teetotaler, a man who reportedly avoided the very substance his entire crew consumed constantly, preferring tea to rum in a world where that preference alone would have marked him as a genuine oddity among his own men. This wasn't some minor personal quirk buried in the historical footnotes either. Roberts was known for maintaining a notably strict, disciplined command style compared to many of his contemporaries, and his ship's articles, the formal code of conduct his crew agreed to before sailing, reportedly included specific restrictions around drinking, particularly forbidding it after a certain hour in the evening, except out in the open on deck where it could be observed, rather than hidden away below in private, unsupervised gatherings where trouble was far more likely to brew undetected. Given everything we've discussed tonight about how alcohol could loosen tongues, inflame grievances, and turn a routine evening into a mutiny, it's difficult not to draw a direct line between Roberts's personal abstinence, his strict regulation of his crew's drinking, and his genuinely extraordinary run of sustained success. A captain who never let his own guard down, commanding a crew whose collective guard was at least somewhat more closely managed than most, might simply have made fewer of the exact mistakes that got other pirate captains captured, killed, or overthrown by their own men. It's worth being careful here not to overstate the case into something tidier than the historical record actually supports. Roberts's crew, despite his personal habits and his articles, was still very much a drinking crew, in the broader sense we've described throughout this entire video, and Roberts himself wasn't running some kind of temperance ship in the modern sense of the word. The restrictions in his articles were about timing, visibility, and operational readiness rather than outright prohibition, which fits the same practical risk management logic we've seen in pirate codes generally, rather than representing some radically different philosophy. What made Roberts unusual wasn't that he eliminated drinking from his ship, it's that he, personally, chose not to participate in the very culture his crew lived inside every single day, and by most accounts commanded genuine respect and loyalty from his men regardless, or perhaps even partly because of it, since a captain visibly unaffected by drink was a captain who could be trusted to make clear-headed decisions when it mattered most. Roberts met his end in February of 1722, killed by grapeshot during an engagement with a Royal Navy warship off the coast of West Africa, reportedly still dressed in his finest clothes, having apparently maintained to the very end the same disciplined, deliberate presentation that had characterized his entire command. His crew. So the story goes, honoured a promise made among themselves and threw his body into the sea rather than allow it to be captured and displayed by the Navy as a trophy and a warning. A final act of loyalty from men who had followed a sober captain through 400 captured ships and, evidently, meant to make sure his story ended on his own terms rather than the Crown's. It's a genuinely fascinating footnote to everything else covered tonight, proof that even in a culture built so thoroughly around alcohol, out of necessity, out of morale, out of simple daily survival, the single most successful practitioner of the entire pirate trade got there, at least in part, by staying remarkably clear-headed while everyone around him did not. We've talked a great deal tonight about what your crew drank, but not yet about the actual moment that drink arrived aboard, the capture itself. And it's worth walking through exactly what that looked like, because the liquor hold of a captured prize was one of the very first things anyone checked once the fighting, if there was any fighting at all, had stopped. You're aboard your ship as it closes the distance on a merchant vessel spotted on the horizon, sails full, weapons checked, and by this point in the voyage you already have a fairly good instinct for what kind of ship you're chasing, based on her build, her flag, and the waters she was found in. A heavy, slow-moving vessel riding low in the water suggests a full cargo hold, and depending on the trade route she's clearly running, colonial goods heading to Europe, or manufactured goods and provisions heading out to the colonies, you've already got a rough guess forming about what you're likely to find below decks. More often than most people realise, the merchant crew struck their colours and surrendered well before any actual combat took place, recognising, correctly, that resistance against a heavily armed, numerically superior pirate crew was far more likely to get them killed than to actually save their cargo. Once the ship is secured, the boarding party's priorities are surprisingly systematic for a group of men popularly imagined as chaotic looters. Weapons and any dangerous crew members get contained first, for obvious safety reasons. Then attention turns quickly to the cargo manifest, if one can be found and the captured captain is willing, or reasonably persuaded, to cooperate, since a manifest tells you in minutes what might otherwise take hours of searching to discover. And liquor, given everything we've established tonight about exactly how central it was to shipboard survival and morale, sat right near the very top of everyone's list of priorities, often checked and confirmed before more valuable, but less immediately useful cargo like fine cloth or manufactured goods had even been fully inventoried. Finding the hold stocked with wine, rum, or brandy was, by every account we have of pirate psychology and behaviour, treated as something close to a genuine celebration. And it's worth understanding why in very practical terms, rather than simply assuming pirates were reflexively greedy for drink above all else. A ship's own liquor supply, as we've spent this entire video establishing, was under constant, grinding pressure from spoilage, rationing, and simple consumption over the course of a long voyage. A captured cargo hold full of fresh, unopened casks represented an immediate, tangible extension of the crew's operational range. Additional weeks or months of safe, palatable drink that didn't require returning to a risky, potentially hostile port to resupply. Transferring the captured casks was genuinely hard, dangerous physical labour, and it's a part of pirate life that rarely makes it into popular depictions, which tend to skip straight from the boarding action to the celebration. Heavy wooden casks had to be manhandled across gangways or lowered by rope between two vessels riding on open water. A task made considerably more difficult if the sea was anything other than calm, and more than one account from the era mentions injuries, sometimes serious ones, sustained not in combat but in the unglamorous business of moving heavy barrels between ships. Once safely aboard, the casks would be inspected, sometimes using exactly the gunpowder proof test we described earlier, to confirm quality and strength before being properly stowed and logged, at which point responsibility for the newly expanded stock passed to the quartermaster, whose job, as we've already covered, was about to get considerably more complicated, managing a suddenly much larger and more varied supply. There's a genuinely important detail buried in all of this that connects back to the earlier discussion of pirate discipline and the ship's articles. A captured ship's crew, particularly if they'd surrendered peacefully without a fight, were often treated with real restraint by comparison to their popular reputation. And this extended to how thoroughly a prize was stripped. Some captains, mindful of exactly the kind of leniency that might encourage future targets to surrender without a costly fight, deliberately left captured crews with enough provisions, sometimes including a modest amount of drink, to make their own way safely to the nearest port, rather than stripping every last resource and leaving them to face a genuine survival crisis of their own. This wasn't universal kindness by any means. Plenty of accounts describe far harsher treatment, but the pattern of at least occasional calculated restraint tells you something real about how pirate crews thought about their own long-term interests. Understanding, correctly, that a reputation for reasonable treatment of those who surrendered without resistance could make future captures considerably easier and less costly than a reputation for total, indiscriminate plunder regardless of cooperation. Before we head back to shore, there's one more piece of shipboard drinking life worth walking through carefully, because it explains a lot about how a pirate crew actually managed to share out a scarce, valuable, and occasionally dangerous resource without tearing itself apart in the process. You're the quartermaster aboard your ship, and while the captain handles combat and navigation, the day-to-day business of dividing food, plunder, and yes, drink falls squarely on your shoulders, and it is, without question, one of the more thankless and genuinely important jobs aboard the entire vessel. Your morning starts with an inventory, because you cannot manage what you haven't counted, and on a ship with a drink supply is a rolling, ever-changing mix of dwindling ship's beer, captured rum, looted wine, and whatever bamboo ingredients happen to still be aboard. Keeping an accurate mental or written tally is a genuine skill. You know exactly how many casks remain, roughly how many days of rationed drinking that represents at current consumption, and, critically, how that number changes the moment a new prize is captured, or a stretch of bad weather stretches the voyage longer than anyone planned for. Get this math wrong, and you're either needlessly restricting a crew who could have been drinking more freely, breeding resentment for no good reason, or you're the person responsible when the good stuff runs out 3 weeks earlier than anyone expected, which breeds an entirely different, considerably more dangerous kind of resentment. Distribution itself is where your job gets genuinely difficult, because you're managing the drinking habits of dozens of armed, occasionally quite intimidating men, each with his own appetite, his own tolerance, and, in more than a few cases, his own willingness to argue loudly about whether he's being shorted. The articles your crew signed before departure likely spell out, in at least broad terms, how shares of captured drink are meant to be divided, and your job is to actually enforce that on a daily basis, measuring out portions with something resembling fairness, even when the supply is running thin and tempers are running short. Favoritism here isn't just personally unpleasant, it's operationally dangerous. A quartermaster who's caught giving his friends larger shares while shorting everyone else is planting the exact seed of resentment that, mixed with a few more rounds of rum on a bad night, can blossom into open confrontation or worse. There's a particular kind of dispute you'll need to referee constantly, and it involves exactly how a share gets defined when the drink in question isn't a neat. Uniform product, but a chaotic mix of captured casks of wildly varying quality. Is a cup of fine Madeira worth the same as a cup of rough, barely strained ship's beer? Your crew's articles might address this directly, assigning drink a rough equivalence regardless of type to keep things simple. Or they might leave it to your judgment, in which case you'd better have a reputation for fairness solid enough that your calls don't spark a fistfight every single time a new cask gets opened. Some crews solve this by simply mixing higher and lower quality drink together before distribution, evening out the difference rather than trying to ration finer spirits separately from rougher ones. A genuinely practical solution to a problem that could otherwise have caused constant friction. You're also the one who has to make the unpopular calls, restricting the ration when supplies are running low, refusing to break out a captured cask of good wine the night before a planned raid because you need every man sober and sharp at dawn, or cutting off a crew member entirely temporarily, as punishment for some infraction covered under your ship's articles. This last one carries real weight, because being cut off from the shared ration wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a visible, public marker of a man standing within the crew, not unlike the naval tradition of denying a sailor his grog as formal punishment. A crew member stripped of his drinking rights for some period had, in a very real sense, been partially cast out of the community that alcohol did so much to bind together in the first place, and restoring that privilege once the punishment period ended was its own small, meaningful ritual of reintegration. And underlying every single one of these decisions is the injury compensation system that many pirate crews built directly into their articles, something we've touched on in other videos covering the pirate code more broadly. A portion of captured plunder, sometimes including liquor stock itself when coin was scarce, was often set aside specifically to compensate crew members for wounds suffered in battle. A lost limb, a lost eye, a disabling injury, paid out according to a fixed, agreed schedule before the remaining plunder was divided among the rest of the crew. As quartermaster, tracking this fund, protecting it from being casually spent down through everyday drinking before an injured man could claim his share, was one of your most serious responsibilities, and it's a genuinely striking detail about pirate life that gets lost in the popular imagination. Beneath the chaos, the drinking, and the violence, there was often a surprisingly rigorous, almost bureaucratic system of fairness operating quietly in the background, and the humble ship's quartermaster, ledger in hand, counting casks and settling disputes over cups of rum, was the man holding that whole fragile system together. Before we get to Port Royal specifically, it's worth going back a little further to an earlier island and an earlier generation of sea raiders entirely, because the drinking culture we've spent this whole video describing didn't spring up fully formed in the golden age of the early 1700s. It had roots stretching back decades earlier to the buccaneers of the mid-17th century, and to one particular island whose name has become almost as synonymous with piracy as any pirate captain's own. Tortuga, a small island off the northwest coast of Hispaniola, became, through the middle decades of the 1600s, the original template for exactly the kind of lawless, drink-soaked pirate haven that Port Royal and later Nassau would each, in their turn, become famous for replicating. The word buccaneer itself actually traces back to this exact community, derived from a French term for the wooden frame, called a boucan, that early settlers on the island used to smoke and preserve meat, a practical, unglamorous origin for a word that would eventually become synonymous with dramatic, high seas adventure. These original buccaneers began as a rough mix of hunters, escaped or freed indentured servants, and general outcasts from various European colonial projects, surviving initially by hunting the wild cattle and pigs that roamed Hispaniola, smoking and selling the preserved meat to passing ships, before gradually drifting, as opportunity and grievance against Spanish colonial authority both presented themselves, into the more profitable and considerably more dangerous business of raiding Spanish shipping directly. Life on Tortuga in this earlier era shared an enormous amount with the later drinking culture we've described tonight, adapted to a somewhat rougher, less commercially developed setting than Port Royal would eventually offer. Rum and other spirits, whatever could be acquired through trade, through raiding, or simply through the limited local production capacity of the island itself, flowed through Tortuga's small settlements in quantities that scandalized the occasional outside visitor who left behind written accounts of the place. The buccaneer community operated with its own rough codes of conduct, early precursors to the more formalized ship's articles that would develop further among later Golden Age pirate crews, and these codes, much like their later descendants, frequently addressed the distribution of plunder, which very often included captured drink among its most immediately valuable and immediately consumable spoils. The buccaneers were also considerably more informally organized in their earliest years than the more structured pirate crews of the following century, operating more as a loose confederation of hunters and raiders bound together by shared circumstance and shared hostility towards Spanish colonial authority than as the tightly articled, democratically governed crews that would characterize the Golden Age proper a few decades later. But the basic drinking patterns were already unmistakably present, heavy reliance on whatever alcohol could be acquired both as a genuine practical necessity given the same unreliable water sources plaguing every other community in this story, and as the primary social currency and evening entertainment available to a rough, transient, overwhelmingly male population living on the genuine edge of colonial society. French colonial authorities eventually established a more formal governing presence on Tortuga, alternately tolerating and attempting to rein in the buccaneer community, depending on the shifting political winds of European conflicts that periodically made buccaneers useful allies against Spain, and periodically made them an embarrassing liability instead. This pattern, official tolerance followed by periodic crackdown followed by renewed tolerance whenever a fresh war made privateers useful again, would repeat itself with remarkable consistency across nearly every pirate haven discussed tonight, Tortuga, Port Royal, and eventually Nassau, all following broadly similar arcs of rise, Golden Age, and eventual suppression or disaster, each one fueled by the same underlying drinking economy that made these settlements so attractive to the rough, dangerous population that gathered there. By the time Tortuga's own prominence began to fade, gradually overshadowed by Port Royal's rising fortunes through the latter half of the 17th century, it had already established nearly every pattern that would define pirate drinking culture for the following 3/4 of a century. The taverns catering to men flush with fresh plunder, the codes governing fair distribution of captured drink, the uneasy relationship with colonial authorities who alternately needed and feared the population they were nominally supposed to be governing. Tortuga was, in this very real sense, the rough draft, the first working model of everything we've spent tonight exploring in its more developed, better documented later forms, and its buccaneers, smoking their wild meat and drinking their rough spirits in a small, defiant settlement off the coast of a Spanish-claimed island, laid down the template that an entire generation of pirates who came after them, in Port Royal, in Nassau, and aboard ships scattered across the length of the Caribbean and beyond, would follow without ever fully realizing exactly how much of their own drinking. Culture had been inherited from the rough, forgotten buccaneers who came before them. Earlier tonight we promised to come back to Port Royal, Jamaica properly, and this is where its story belongs, because if any single place on earth deserves the title of rum capital of the pirate world, it's this one. By the 1660s and 1670s, Port Royal had grown from a modest fortified settlement into one of the wealthiest and most notorious towns in the entire English colonial world, and it built that reputation on two closely intertwined foundations: piracy and rum. The town's position at the mouth of Kingston Harbour made it an ideal base for privateers and pirates operating throughout the Caribbean. Close enough to shipping lanes to make raiding practical, defensible enough to discourage casual reprisal, and, crucially, entirely willing to look the other way on exactly how its most profitable visitors had acquired their coin. English colonial authorities in Jamaica had, for a period, actively encouraged privateering against Spanish shipping, and the line between a privateer operating under official sanction and an outright pirate operating under none at all was, in practice, thinner than either side liked to admit. Port Royal profited from both equally, and it showed no particular interest in asking too many questions. What that money actually bought, once a crew came ashore after weeks or months at sea, tells you almost everything about the town's character. Contemporary accounts, some no doubt exaggerated for dramatic effect, but broadly consistent across multiple independent sources, describe a town absolutely dense, with taverns, brothels, and gambling houses, catering almost entirely to sailors, with pockets full of freshly captured Spanish silver, and an overwhelming urge to spend it as quickly as possible. Rum flowed through Port Royal in genuinely staggering quantities, imported from surrounding Jamaican plantations, and consumed with an enthusiasm that shocked even visitors from other rough colonial ports. One popular, though likely embellished, estimate held that the town supported a drinking establishment for something close to every 10 residents, a ratio that, even allowing for exaggeration, paints a picture of a settlement built almost entirely around the business of separating sailors from their money as efficiently as possible, with rum as the primary instrument. You're a pirate stepping ashore in Port Royal after a successful voyage, your share of the prize weighing down your pocket, and here's what the town has waiting for you. The moment you're off the longboat, you're being pulled toward one tavern or another, sometimes literally, by proprietors and their staff who have learnt exactly how to read a freshly paid crew, and exactly how little resistance they're likely to put up. Rum is cheap and plentiful here in a way it never was aboard ship. No rationing, no careful dilution into bamboo to stretch a limited supply. Just cup after cup for as long as your coin holds out. Stories, almost certainly exaggerated in the retelling but rooted in a real pattern of behaviour, describe pirates blowing through months of hard-won plunder in a matter of days or weeks, drinking, gambling and carousing until the money ran dry, at which point the only sensible option left was to go back to sea and do it all over again. Whether that cycle was quite as extreme or quite as universal as the legend suggests is genuinely difficult to verify, but the underlying pattern, easy money meeting an equally easy way to lose it, was real enough that Port Royal's reputation as a den of excess has survived largely intact for more than 3 centuries. The town's relationship with rum went beyond simple consumption too. Port Royal sat close enough to Jamaica's expanding sugar plantations that it functioned as a genuine hub for the rum trade itself, not merely a place to drink it, but a place where it was bought, sold, and shipped onward to other colonial markets. Merchants in the town grew wealthy supplying both the legitimate colonial trade and the far less legitimate demands of the pirates who called the harbour home, and for a while, remarkably, colonial authorities tolerated this arrangement, because Port Royal's pirates were, at least some of the time, still useful against Jamaica's Spanish rivals in the region. It was an uneasy, mutually beneficial arrangement between a colonial government and a population of outlaws, held together in no small part by the steady flow of rum lubricating the whole relationship. And then, on the 7th of June in 1692, the arrangement ended in the most abrupt way imaginable. A massive earthquake struck Port Royal, and within minutes a large portion of the town, built largely on unstable, sandy ground, simply liquefied and slid into the harbour, taking a significant percentage of its population down with it. Survivors described the ground itself turning to something like quicksand beneath their feet, buildings sinking whole into the earth, and the sea rushing in over what had, moments before, been solid streets. Many contemporaries, particularly religious voices of the era, seized on the disaster as unmistakable divine judgment against a town that had, in their view, earned its destruction through decades of drunkenness, greed, and lawlessness. Whatever you make of that particular interpretation, the practical result was unambiguous. Port Royal never fully recovered its former position, and the pirate haven that had spent decades as the rum-soaked beating heart of Caribbean piracy was, in the span of a few catastrophic minutes, largely swallowed by the sea it had built its entire fortune upon. Port Royal's fall didn't end pirate drinking culture, of course. It simply scattered it elsewhere, toward other emerging havens like Nassau in the Bahamas, which would go on to host its own remarkable, if shorter-lived, experiment in pirate self-governance during the height of the Golden Age a few decades later. But for the crews who had known it in its prime, Port Royal remained the benchmark, the place where rum flowed most freely, where fortunes vanished fastest, and where the entire relationship between piracy and drink was displayed most vividly, right up until the moment the ground itself decided it had seen enough. Nassau deserves its own proper telling too, because by the time it rose to prominence in the years following Port Royal's collapse, it had become something genuinely unprecedented. A settlement where, for a brief window stretching roughly from 1713 to 1718, pirates weren't simply tolerated the way they'd been in Port Royal's earlier heyday, they were, in practical terms, running the place outright. With the War of Spanish Succession recently ended and colonial authority in the Bahamas left weak and underfunded, pirate crews moved into the harbour at New Providence Island in large enough numbers that Nassau effectively became a self-governing pirate settlement, sometimes described, with only mild exaggeration, as a genuine pirate republic. Estimates of the town's pirate population during its peak years run into the thousands, an extraordinary concentration of exactly the kind of men we've spent this entire video discussing, all sharing the same practical needs, the same appetite for drink, and, crucially, no meaningful colonial government left to regulate any of it. You're a pirate arriving in Nassau during these years, and what greets you is a settlement built almost entirely around the immediate practical needs of men who've just spent months at sea and have coin burning a hole in their pockets. Taverns and makeshift drinking establishments sprang up along the waterfront in numbers that mirrored, and by some accounts exceeded, Port Royal's own earlier reputation, catering specifically to a population with essentially no other entertainment competing for its attention, and no local authority inclined to impose any real restriction on how that population chose to spend its evenings. Rum flowed through Nassau via much the same supply routes that had always fed the Caribbean drinking economy, nearby plantation production, captured cargo, and opportunistic trade with merchants willing to look past the obvious source of their customers' coin, and the town's informal governance, to the extent it existed at all during these years, was shaped substantially by exactly the same democratic, consensus-based instincts that governed individual pirate crews under their own ship's articles. This is genuinely one of the more remarkable footnotes in the entire history we've covered tonight, because Nassau during these years functioned, in a rough and admittedly chaotic way, as a kind of town-sized version of the same egalitarian structures we've described aboard individual pirate ships throughout this video. Disputes settled through negotiation and rough consensus among a population who had, almost to a man, already demonstrated their unwillingness to simply accept authority imposed from above without question. Drink played exactly the same social role here that it played aboard ship, the shared currency of evenings spent in taverns rather than around a ship's hearth, the lubricant for exactly the same kind of community bonding, dispute airing, and occasional violence that characterized shipboard drinking culture, just scaled up across an entire settlement rather than confined to a single crew. Nassau's run as a genuinely lawless pirate haven came to an end in 1718, when Woodes Rogers, The newly appointed royal governor we discussed earlier, in connection with his broader campaign against piracy's supply chains, arrived with a royal pardon in one hand and a mandate to re-establish formal colonial authority in the other. Some pirates took the pardon and settled into legitimate, or at least considerably less openly criminal, lives. And there's a certain fitting irony in the fact that more than a few reportedly ended up running taverns themselves, applying their intimate, hard-won knowledge of exactly what a thirsty, coin-flush sailor wanted to drink toward a legitimate business rather than a life of raiding. Others refused the pardon entirely and simply relocated their operations elsewhere, carrying the same drinking culture, the same rough codes of conduct, and the same practical relationship with rum that we've traced across Tortuga, Port Royal, and now Nassau, onward to whatever the next chapter of the Golden Age happened to bring. Between Tortuga, Port Royal, and Nassau, the pattern is unmistakable by now. Rum and rough self-governance rising together, flourishing together, and eventually being brought down together, whether by earthquake, royal pardon, or simple naval pressure. But all of this has assumed a functioning supply chain, a haven to resupply at, a captured cask to fall back on. It's worth asking now what happened on the rare, far more terrifying occasions when that supply chain broke down completely, out at sea with no haven anywhere in reach. When the beer was long gone, the rum casks were empty, and the water remaining in the hold had gone from merely unpleasant to genuinely undrinkable. This is where the story stops being about morale and social ritual and becomes, quite simply, about survival. A voyage that ran longer than planned, whether through navigational error, unfavourable winds, a prolonged chase, or simply bad luck, could push a crew into exactly this situation. And the historical and maritime record, drawn from ships of every nation and every era of the Age of Sail, contains genuinely harrowing accounts of what desperate sailors resorted to when every normal option had been exhausted. Rainwater collection, discussed earlier as a routine backup measure, became an urgent life-or-death priority in these circumstances, with crews straining every scrap of sailcloth into makeshift catchment systems the moment clouds gathered on the horizon, because a missed rainstorm in these conditions wasn't a minor inconvenience. It was potentially the difference between reaching land and not reaching it at all. Some accounts from sailors who survived extended periods with critically low fresh water describe attempts to distill seawater using whatever crude apparatus could be improvised aboard ship. Heating seawater and attempting to capture and cool the resulting steam to collect a small amount of fresh condensation. The process was wildly inefficient by any modern standard, consuming scarce fuel to produce a genuinely tiny yield of drinkable water. But in a true emergency, a tiny yield was infinitely better than none, and the basic principle that boiling seawater and capturing the vapour separates out the salt was understood in at least a rough, practical sense well before anyone had the scientific vocabulary to properly explain why it worked. In the most extreme and genuinely desperate situations, historical accounts describe castaways and stranded sailors resorting to measures that even a hardened crew would have considered a last resort, drinking their own collected sweat. Or, in documented cases from shipwreck survivors across several centuries, the blood of captured turtles or fish, which contained enough fluid to briefly stave off the worst effects of dehydration, even though it did nothing to address the underlying thirst in any satisfying way. Sailors understood, largely through hard experience passed down as folk wisdom rather than any scientific understanding, that drinking seawater directly was a mistake that made thirst dramatically worse rather than better, dehydrating the body further even as it filled the stomach. And this understanding, crude as it was, likely saved countless lives simply by preventing desperate men from reaching for the one source of liquid that surrounded them in effectively infinite supply and was actively, chemically working against their survival the entire time. These crises tested the social fabric of a crew as severely as any storm or naval engagement, and this is where the fairness we discussed in the quartermaster's role became something closer to a matter of life and death rather than simple morale management. A crew facing a genuine water emergency needed absolute trust that whatever remained was being divided honestly, because the alternative, a crew that suspected favoritism or theft from a critically low shared supply, was a crew one bad rumour away from violence. Historical accounts of exactly these situations describe captains and quartermasters going to considerable lengths to demonstrate fairness publicly, measuring out final rations in full view of the entire crew, sometimes even drinking last themselves specifically to prove that no one, regardless of rank, was receiving special treatment while the supply dwindled toward zero. The good news, if there's any good news buried in this particular chapter, is that these truly catastrophic emergencies were relatively rare compared to the routine, grinding unpleasantness of merely bad water that we spent our first chapter tonight describing. Most voyages, even long and difficult ones, managed to restock at some point before things reached this kind of genuine crisis point. And the entire elaborate system we've walked through tonight, small beer, rum, grog, careful rationing, superstition and social ritual, existed largely to keep any given voyage comfortably on the routine side of that line, rather than tipping over into the genuinely desperate side of it. But the fact that the desperate side existed at all, that experienced sailors could describe in specific, practical detail exactly what to do when the water and the rum both ran out, tells you everything about how seriously this entire subject was taken by the people who actually had to live it, day after day, cask after cask, all the way across an ocean that had absolutely no interest in making any of it easy for them. Before we get to the sudden, dramatic disasters, it's worth spending a moment on the slower, quieter cost of all this drinking, because a life built around daily alcohol consumption, however necessary it was for the reasons we've spent this whole video explaining, took a genuine toll on the body over time, and pirates lived with that toll in ways that rarely make it into the popular imagination. You've been at sea for years now, moving from ship to ship, crew to crew, and your body carries the accumulated evidence of a life built substantially around rum, sugar and salt. Your teeth, already under constant assault from a diet of hard biscuit and preserved meat, are further worn down by the sugar content in bamboo and the acidity of the wine and brandy that occasionally supplemented your ration. And dental problems were extraordinarily common among sailors of this era, regardless of their drinking habits. But the sweetened, spiced drinks favoured aboard ship certainly weren't helping matters. Toothaches, abscesses and eventual tooth loss were simply an expected feature of a long career at sea, treated, when treated at all, with crude extraction rather than anything resembling modern dentistry, and a badly infected tooth could, in the worst cases documented from this era, actually kill a man through the spread of infection into the bloodstream, a genuinely horrifying possibility for a problem that seems almost trivial by modern standards. The cumulative effect of years of heavy drinking on the liver and the broader digestive system was, of course, entirely unknown and unrecognised in any scientific sense during this era. But sailors and pirates who survived long enough into a drinking career, and plenty didn't survive long at all given the general hazards of the profession, would have experienced at least some of the same physical consequences familiar to us today, however unexplained the cause remained to them at the time. Older long-time sailors and pirates are occasionally described in period accounts as showing signs of what we would now readily recognise as the physical markers of chronic heavy drinking, though contemporaries had no real framework for connecting these symptoms back to years of daily rum consumption specifically, more often attributing declining health simply to the general hardship of a difficult life at sea. There was also a genuine tension, worth acknowledging honestly, between alcohol's real, documented benefit in making unsafe water safer to drink and the entirely separate, cumulative harm of drinking that same alcohol in significant quantities, day after day, for years on end. This wasn't a contradiction sailors of the era could easily resolve, because the alternative to daily alcohol consumption, in an era before any reliable method of water purification existed, was often genuinely worse in the short term, a very real risk of dysentery or worse from contaminated water, weighed against a slower, less immediately visible cost that wouldn't meaningfully show itself for years. Faced with that choice, and it genuinely was a choice most sailors and pirates were making, whether they framed it in these terms or not, every single day of their working lives, the short-term risk of foul water understandably won out over the long-term, poorly understood risk of the drink they were using to avoid it. None of this made pirates unique among the working population of their era, to be clear. Chronic heavy drinking was widespread across nearly every level of society in this period, from dock workers to nobility, and sailors were simply one professional group among many for whom alcohol consumption ran at a level that would alarm nearly any modern physician. But there was something particularly acute about the pirate and sailor's version of this story, because for them, unlike a land-bound tradesman who drank heavily purely out of habit or culture, the drinking was genuinely functionally necessary for daily survival, in a way that made the entire question of moderation almost beside the point. You drank because the water would kill you faster than the rum would, and you simply hoped, without any real way of knowing, that you'd reach old age, or at least reach the end of your particular voyage, before the slower cost caught up with you. Let's talk about the darker side of all this drinking, because for every warm evening of shared bamboo and songs on deck, there was a flip side to shipboard alcohol consumption that could turn deadly with almost no warning at all, and pirate history is full of exactly these moments. Start with the most famous pirate name in the entire Golden Age, Edward Teach, better known to history as Blackbeard, and consider the account of his final battle off the coast of North Carolina in November of 1718. Historical accounts, drawn largely from the report of Lieutenant Robert Maynard, the naval officer who led the expedition against him, describe Blackbeard and his crew having spent the previous evening drinking heavily aboard their sloop, a detail that fits an established pattern of pirate crews using alcohol to steady nerves, boost morale, and pass the time during the long stretches of waiting that made up far more of pirate life than the swashbuckling combat popular culture tends to emphasize. Whether or not that drinking meaningfully affected the crew's readiness the following morning is genuinely difficult to say with certainty, since surviving accounts come primarily from the side that won the engagement and had every incentive to portray their fallen enemy in the least flattering light possible. But the broader pattern the story reflects, heavy drinking the night before combat readiness mattered most, was a very real and very documented risk that captains across the Golden Age of Piracy had to actively manage. Mutiny is where the darker side of shipboard drinking really shows its teeth, because alcohol didn't just risk impairing a crew during combat, it also had a habit of loosening tongues, inflaming old grudges, and turning simmering resentments into open confrontation far faster than sober conversation ever would. Pirate crews were, by their very nature, communities of men who had already demonstrated a willingness to defy legitimate authority once, by turning to piracy in the first place, and that same willingness to defy authority didn't simply switch off the moment they signed a new captain's articles. A captain who drank alongside his crew, as many did, blurring the already thin line of authority that held a democratically structured pirate ship together in the first place, was navigating a genuinely delicate balance between camaraderie and the loss of exactly the respect and clear-headed judgment his position depended on. Historical accounts of pirate crews turning on their own captains describe more than a few instances where heavy drinking played a documented role in the immediate lead-up to the confrontation, emboldening men who might otherwise have kept their grievances to themselves until resentment had genuinely boiled over into open, sometimes violent, disagreement. A captain perceived as taking an unfair share of plunder, showing favouritism in the distribution of captured drink itself, or making decisions the crew judged reckless or cowardly, could find that exact grievance, nursed quietly for weeks, suddenly voiced loudly and dangerously the moment a captured cask of good wine had done its work loosening the tongues of men who'd normally have kept there. Complaints to themselves rather than risk a captain's punishment. This is precisely why so many ship's articles treated the fair, transparent distribution of drink as seriously as they treated the distribution of coin and plunder more broadly, because captains and quartermasters alike understood, from hard experience if nothing else, that a crew's simmering resentments had a genuinely reliable habit of surfacing exactly when the rum was flowing most freely. A crew nursing genuine grievances against a captain over pay, over harsh discipline, over decisions that had cost lives or profits, was considerably more likely to act on those grievances after several rounds of captured rum had stripped away whatever restraint sobriety had previously provided. Pirate ships' articles, the very documents that in many cases regulated drinking in the first place, often existed precisely because crews and captains alike understood this risk, and a captain who failed to manage his crew's relationship with alcohol was, in a very real sense, gambling with his own authority and quite possibly his own life. Not every captain tolerated the risks of a loose relationship with drink, and it's worth looking at the other end of the spectrum before we close, because the contrast is genuinely illuminating. Zheng Yisao, also known as Qing Shi, who commanded one of the largest pirate confederations in recorded history along the South China coast in the early 19th century, presided over a code of conduct famous for its severity, and alcohol discipline was very much part of that severity. Her fleet's regulations reportedly imposed serious, sometimes fatal, punishment for crew members caught drinking without permission or drinking while on duty, a stark contrast to the comparatively looser, more negotiated relationship with alcohol found aboard many Caribbean pirate vessels earlier in the century. Her fleet, by most accounts, was extraordinarily large, disciplined, and effective, commanding the loyalty and fear of imperial forces sent against it for years, and it's difficult not to notice the correlation between that level of operational effectiveness and the strictness of her approach to exactly the kind of risk we've spent this entire video discussing. Where Caribbean pirate articles often regulated drinking without eliminating it, treating alcohol as a necessary and manageable part of shipboard life, Zheng Yisao's regulations suggest a captain who had concluded that the risks of drink, at least during active duty, simply outweighed any benefit to morale or hydration that a more relaxed policy might have provided. The simple existence of these harsh countermeasures across such different pirate traditions, separated by an ocean and more than half a century, tells you something important about how seriously experienced commanders took the danger. Nobody imposes a fatal penalty for a problem that isn't real. There's also the simple, unglamorous matter of accidents, because a ship is an extraordinarily dangerous place even for a stone-cold sober crew working with their full wits about them, and it becomes exponentially more dangerous for a crew who has spent the evening deep in a captured cask of Madeira. Rigging accidents, falls from the mast, disputes that turned violent over disagreements too trivial to remember the following morning, all of these appear throughout the historical and anecdotal record of pirate life, tangled up inextricably with the drinking culture that otherwise did so much to hold crews together through genuinely difficult circumstances. Alcohol, in other words, was never simply a comfort or simply a hazard. It was both, constantly, at the same time, and every pirate crew navigating a long voyage was, whether they thought about it in these terms or not, constantly balancing the very real benefits of a daily ration against the very real risks of exactly how much of that ration to allow. There's one final piece of this story worth telling, because it shows just how deeply rum had woven itself into the entire pirate economy, so deeply that eventually the very authorities trying to stamp out piracy realized that attacking the rum supply directly was every bit as effective as attacking pirate ships themselves. By the later years of the Golden Age, particularly through the 1710s, colonial and naval authorities had grown increasingly frustrated with how difficult pirates were to suppress through combat alone, given how easily a fast, lightly crewed pirate sloop could evade a larger, slower naval vessel across the maze of islands and channels making up the Caribbean. Nassau in the Bahamas had by this point emerged as the successor to Port Royal's earlier role, an effectively self-governing pirate haven where crews could resupply, sell plunder and drink freely without much fear of interference, and any serious effort to break piracy's grip on the region had to reckon with Nassau directly. Woodes Rogers, appointed as the Royal Governor of the Bahamas in 1718, with an explicit mandate to bring piracy in the region under control, understood something important that pure military force alone couldn't easily achieve. A pirate haven like Nassau ran, in a very real sense, on rum, both as the daily comfort keeping its transient population of hardened, dangerous men reasonably content, and as a genuine economic engine, with taverns, merchants and suppliers all profiting from the steady flow of captured coin being spent as quickly as it arrived. Rogers arrived with a royal pardon on offer for any pirate willing to renounce the trade, and alongside that carrot came a genuine effort to disrupt exactly the kind of easy, lawless supply chain that had let Nassau flourish as a haven in the first place, tightening naval patrols specifically aimed at intercepting the merchant and smuggling vessels that kept Nassau's taverns stocked, and working to establish enough of a formal, garrisoned authority in the town itself that the previous free-for-all simply couldn't continue unchallenged. The pardon offer and the supply disruption worked together more effectively than either would have alone. A pirate weighing his options in this new, more difficult environment was no longer just weighing the physical risk of capture against the potential reward of plunder. He was also increasingly facing a Nassau that could no longer promise the same easy, rum-soaked welcome it once had, with tightening patrols making resupply riskier and authorities increasingly present in a town that had previously offered almost none. For a meaningful number of pirates, the calculation shifted enough that the pardon started to look like the better deal, and Rogers' efforts, while far from instantly or completely successful, marked a genuine turning point in the broader campaign against piracy in the region, one built as much on economic and logistical pressure as on any single naval victory. It's a detail that tends to get lost in the more dramatic, combat-focused version of pirate history that popular culture prefers: cannon fire, boarding actions, dramatic last stands. But the quieter, more bureaucratic story of governors and naval administrators working to choke off exactly the kind of liquor supply chain we spent this entire video describing tells you something genuinely important about how central drink was to the entire pirate world, so central that disrupting it was recognized correctly as one of the more effective tools available for bringing the whole system down. You could not easily separate the pirate from his rum, and the authorities who eventually succeeded in bringing the Golden Age of Piracy to its close understood that better than most. There's another chapter of this story that deserves its own telling, because it involves two of the most famous names in all of pirate history, and their relationship with the drinking culture we've spent tonight describing tells you something genuinely interesting about how gender operated within it. Anne Bonny and Mary Read sailed together aboard a sloop commanded by John Rackham, known as Calico Jack, in the early 1720s, and both women are documented, through the surviving trial records generated after their eventual capture, as having lived and fought as full, active members of the crew, disguised for much of their time aboard, though their identities were reportedly known to at least some of the crew before the truth became public knowledge more broadly. What's genuinely striking, reading through the accounts and trial testimony that survive from this period, is how thoroughly both women appear to have integrated into every aspect of shipboard life, combat, labour, and yes, drinking, right alongside the men they sailed with, rather than existing in some separate sheltered category aboard ship. Contemporary accounts and later retellings describe both women as capable of matching their male shipmates drink for drink, participating fully in exactly the kind of evening drinking rituals, toasts and social bonding we discussed earlier tonight, rather than abstaining or being excluded from this central piece of pirate social life. This detail matters more than it might initially seem, because it tells you something real about how pirate crews, for all their reputation as a violent, exclusively masculine world, could accommodate genuine equality in at least this one specific, meaningful respect, when the individuals involved had proven themselves capable and committed shipmates in every other way that mattered aboard a working vessel. Drinking wasn't gatekept as some exclusively male ritual that Bonny and Reed were merely tolerated around the edges of. It was, by most accounts, something they participated in as full and equal members of the crew's shared social world. This stands in genuinely interesting contrast to the broader society either woman had left behind to become a pirate in the first place, a world where women drinking openly, particularly drinking heavily in mixed company, carried far heavier social stigma than it did for men engaging in exactly the same behaviour. Aboard a pirate ship, at least for these two specific well-documented women, that particular social constraint appears to have simply fallen away, dissolved by the much more pressing, practical realities of shipboard survival that we've spent this entire video describing. When the water might kill you and the rum was how you avoided it, the question of whether a woman ought to be drinking that rum alongside the men became, in this particular, narrow context, almost entirely beside the point. Both women were captured in October of 1720, when their ship was overtaken by a Jamaican privateering vessel. And one detail from the accounts of that final engagement has become a genuinely famous, if somewhat contested, part of their legend. Multiple sources describe Bonny and Reed as being among the few crew members still willing to fight as the ship was overtaken, with the bulk of the male crew reportedly having retreated below decks, in some tellings because they were too drunk or too demoralised to mount an effective defence, while the two women continued fighting on deck. Whether every detail of that specific account is precisely accurate is difficult to fully verify, given how much embellishment tends to accumulate around exactly this kind of dramatic, gender-defying moment in the retelling. But the core of the story, that these two women were, by every account, every bit as committed to the fight, and every bit as integrated into the crew's shared culture of drink and camaraderie as any man aboard, has held up remarkably well across 3 centuries of retelling. Both women were tried, and both, according to the surviving court records, avoided execution by claiming pregnancy, a claim the court was obligated to investigate and, if verified, to honour by delaying sentence, and the historical record on what ultimately became of each woman afterward remains genuinely incomplete and disputed in exactly the way so much of this era's history tends to be. What their story adds to everything else we've covered tonight is a reminder that the drinking culture built out of pure grinding necessity aboard a pirate ship didn't respect the same social boundaries that governed drinking ashore. Necessity in this one specific narrow way proved to be a genuinely levelling force, and 2 of history's most famous female pirates lived, fought, and drank as full equals within a world that would have denied them exactly that equality almost anywhere else they might have gone. Before we wrap up entirely, let's rewind all the way back to the very beginning of any pirate voyage. Because everything we've discussed tonight, the water going bad, the beer running dry, the rum arriving through capture and improvisation, actually starts on a single frantic day back at whatever port a crew was operating out of, the day the ship was provisioned before ever setting sail at all. You're aboard your ship, tied up at anchor, and today is provisioning day, which means today is one of the most important and one of the most quietly stressful days of the entire voyage ahead, even though not a single mile of it has been sailed yet. Every decision made today about exactly how much water, how much beer, and how much of whatever spirits happen to be available gets loaded into the hold will directly determine how comfortable, or how genuinely desperate, the coming weeks or months are going to be. And there's no going back to fix a mistake once you're a week out from land with a hold that was loaded wrong. The math involved here is genuinely more complicated than it might first appear. Because you're not simply calculating how much liquid a crew of a given size will drink over an estimated voyage length, you're calculating that figure against a voyage length that is, by definition, only ever an estimate, subject to bad weather, unexpected chases, extended searches for prizes, or simply getting lost. In an era before reliable methods of determining longitude made position finding at sea a matter of considerable uncertainty even for skilled navigators. Load too little, and you're facing exactly the kind of desperate water and drink shortage we discussed a little earlier tonight. Load too much, and you're sacrificing valuable cargo space and adding significant weight to casks of liquid that might spoil before they're ever consumed anyway. Every experienced quartermaster and captain carried some working formula in his head, refined through hard experience and probably more than a few uncomfortable voyages that had taught the lesson the difficult way. For roughly how much of each type of drink a crew of a given size needed for a voyage of a given expected length, with a reasonable safety margin built in for exactly the kind of delays that seem to happen constantly in practice. Loading the actual casks was its own considerable physical undertaking, requiring the ship's boats to ferry barrel after barrel out from shore, and requiring careful thought about exactly where in the hold each type of cargo went, since water and beer casks needed placement that balanced the ship properly, kept them reasonably cool and out of direct sun where possible, and left them accessible enough that crew could actually reach and rotate through the supply without having to unload half the hold every time someone needed a fresh cask tapped. A poorly loaded ship, with critical supplies buried under less urgent cargo, could turn a routine resupply task partway through a voyage into a genuinely time-consuming, laborious ordeal, which is exactly the kind of mistake an experienced quartermaster took considerable care to avoid making in the first place. There's also the question of exactly where this provisioning day's supplies actually came from, and for a pirate crew this wasn't always a simple matter of walking down to a market and purchasing what was needed outright. Crews operating from established, tolerant havens like Nassau, or in its earlier heyday Port Royal, could generally provision relatively openly, paying merchants who had learnt not to ask too many pointed questions about the origin of a pirate's coin. Crews operating with less secure access to a friendly port faced a more difficult set of choices, sometimes provisioning through smugglers or corrupt local officials willing to look the other way for a cut of the proceeds, sometimes simply timing their provisioning runs to coincide with a recent successful capture that had conveniently solved the entire question by delivering a hold full of drink directly into their hands without any purchase required at all. And once the casks were loaded, the water topped off, the beer stowed, whatever rum or wine happened to be available secured below, there was, by most accounts, a genuine sense of occasion to the moment the ship actually cast off, and the whole carefully calculated, carefully loaded supply began its slow, inevitable countdown toward the exact problems we've spent this entire video describing. Every voyage began, in this very real sense, with a fully stocked hold and a crew's collective, unspoken awareness that everything in it, the water most of all, was already quietly beginning to turn the moment the anchor came up, and that the entire elaborate culture of beer, rum, grog, rationing and ritual we've walked through tonight existed for one single simple reason: to buy a ship's crew enough safe, drinkable comfort to survive the gap between this provisioning day and the next one, however long and however uncertain that gap turned out to be. Before we close out tonight, it's worth taking a moment to notice just how much of this entire story is still sitting quietly inside modern English, waiting to be recognised every time we reach for a phrase without thinking twice about where it actually came from. We've already covered a few of these tonight: proof, grog, groggy, limey, but the list runs considerably longer once you start looking. Being 3 sheets to the wind, used today to describe someone thoroughly drunk, comes directly from sailing terminology referring to the ropes. Called sheets, that controlled a ship's sails. A sheet allowed to run loose in the wind made a sail flap uncontrolled and the ship handle erratically, and a sailor stumbling and swaying with drink was, to his shipmates, moving in exactly the same uncontrolled, flapping way as a poorly secured sail. Splicing the mainbrace, an old naval expression for issuing an extra ration of rum to celebrate a special occasion or reward a crew after difficult, dangerous work, has survived as a phrase long after the actual practice of hand-splicing rope rigging faded from relevance, and it remains, remarkably, an occasionally invoked ceremonial phrase in some naval traditions even today. Even the humble word toast, as in raising a toast, has a genuinely direct connection to this world, tracing back to the older practice of placing a piece of spiced or charred bread into a cup of wine to improve its flavour. A habit common enough aboard ship and ashore alike that the name for the bread eventually transferred to the entire ritual of the drink itself. There's something genuinely worth reflecting on in the fact that an entire vocabulary, born out of desperate practical necessity, out of men trying to survive months at sea without safe water, without refrigeration, without any understanding of the microorganisms actually threatening their lives, has outlived the ships, the casks, and the crews themselves by centuries, embedding itself so thoroughly into everyday language that most people using these words have absolutely no idea they're quoting a sailor's solution to a problem most of us will never have to face even once in our entire lives. Every time someone describes a friend as 3 sheets to the wind after one too many drinks, they're unknowingly reaching back across 300 years to a sailor clinging to rigging, watching a loose sail whip uselessly in a storm, and recognizing, with the particular clarity that comes from genuine danger, exactly what a man who'd lost control of himself actually looked like. It isn't just words that survived, either. Several rum-producing companies still operating today, some in Barbados, some elsewhere across the Caribbean, trace their own histories and distilling traditions directly back to distilleries operating during this exact period. The very same rough, practical industry that grew up around sugar plantation molasses and eventually filled the casks aboard every ship we've discussed tonight. A bottle of rum purchased today, refined, aged, and marketed in ways that would have been utterly unrecognisable to an 18th century sailor drinking his ration straight from a barrel, still carries, somewhere in its production process, an unbroken thread of technique and tradition reaching back to those first rough-kill devil distilleries. The pirate aesthetic that modern rum brands so cheerfully lean into, the skull and crossbones on the label, the tropical island branding, the vaguely swashbuckling marketing copy is, in this narrow but genuine sense, advertising something that isn't entirely fictional. And there's one more layer to this story worth sitting with before we close out tonight, because it ties everything we've discussed back together in a way that's genuinely worth reflecting on. The entire reason pirates and sailors more broadly turned to beer, then rum, then grog in the first place, was because plain water, the most basic, essential substance for human survival, had become something they couldn't fully trust. Every cup of bamboo, every ration of grog, every captured bottle of Madeira split among a grateful crew was, at its core, a workaround for a problem that modern life has almost entirely solved without most of us ever thinking about it twice. So, tonight, as you drift off, maybe with a glass of actual perfectly safe water sitting on your nightstand, spare a thought for the sailors and pirates who never had that luxury, who built an entire drinking culture, an entire economy of captured casks and diluted rum and carefully rationed grog, purely out of the ordinary human need to survive long enough to see the next landfall. They didn't drink because the life was glamorous. They drank because the alternative, more often than not, was thirst, sickness, or worse. And out of that grim necessity came traditions, words, and rituals that have outlived the Golden Age of Piracy itself by centuries. Proof, grog, groggy, limey, small words, quietly carrying an enormous salt-soaked history, every time we use them without a second thought. Sleep well tonight and be grateful for your tap.